He had everything: power, wealth, influence, an empire that stretched across industries. But one night, it all came crashing down. No one saw it coming. No one expected him to vanish. But the world had no idea where the billionaire had gone. But let me ask you, if you lost everything today, who would truly stand by you? Comment below. Under the cover of darkness, Alexander Drake, the billionaire everyone once worshipped, stepped into a world where no one knew his name. He had spent years building his fortune, decades mastering the art of power. People bowed at his presence, whispered his name in admiration and fear. But none of that mattered now. Not in the cold, unforgiving streets. Not when his wealth had been stripped from him in a single, merciless stroke. The fall wasn't gradual. It was swift, brutal. A hostile takeover, one that left him with nothing but the clothes on his back. His name, once a force in the business world, now meant nothing. His face, once gracing magazine covers, was now just another forgotten man in the crowd. But here's the real question. Why would a man with everything throw it all away? What was he searching for? The night swallowed him whole as he stepped beyond the towering skyscrapers that once bore his initials. He walked without a destination, his hands deep in the torn pockets of a coat that wasn't his. He had purchased it that morning from a thrift store, one of the last few bills he had left. The rest of his wealth? Frozen, stolen, gone. But was it theft if it had been orchestrated by people he trusted? A betrayal so calculated, so cold, that even now, the memory made his chest tighten. Would they recognize him if they saw him like this? Would they stop, hesitate, show even an ounce of guilt? He knew the answer. He passed familiar streets, places where once his luxury cars would glide through effortlessly. Now, the sidewalks felt different beneath his feet. His polished leather shoes, the kind that used to command attention, had been replaced with torn sneakers, the soles uneven, forcing an awkward limp in his stride. The world hadn't changed. He had. The first thing he noticed was the stares. People looked at him differently now. A woman walking past clutched her purse tighter. A man waiting at the corner shuffled away, his expression unreadable but clear in its message. Stay away from me. No one knew him. No one saw him. And yet, wasn't that exactly what he had wanted? To disappear? But this was different. His stomach tightened. Not with fear, but with something foreign to him. Hunger. He had never truly known what it felt like. Sure, he had skipped meals before, too busy closing deals or flying across the world to bother eating. But this was different. This wasn't a choice, this was necessity. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't thought about water until now. He hadn't thought about how quickly the human body weakened without its comforts. And then, the realization settled in. This was just the beginning. Now let me ask you, could you survive a single night without the luxuries you take for granted? No phone, no money, no one to call, no place to sleep. Because that's exactly where Alexander Drake found himself. Alone. Lost. And for the first time in his life, powerless. The air was colder than he expected, the stares harsher, the hunger clawing at his stomach like an old friend he had never met before. Alexander walked without purpose, his hands shoved into the pockets of the oversized coat he had picked up earlier that day. His body, once accustomed to temperature-controlled offices and chauffeured rides, now braced against the bite of the night wind. The streetlights buzzed above, flickering, casting broken shadows against the damp pavement. He passed by stores closing for the night, their glass windows reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized. A beggar, a ghost, a man stripped of everything but breath and bone. The people who once sought his attention, the ones who had fought to be in his presence, now walked past without a glance. They didn't see him. Or maybe they did, and chose to ignore him. For the first time, Alexander understood something he had never before considered: what it felt like to be invisible. He moved past a row of restaurants, the scent of food hitting him like a taunt. His stomach twisted violently. He hadn't eaten since morning, back when he still had something left. He paused at the corner of an upscale diner, where the aroma of seared steak and buttered bread wrapped around him. Through the window, he saw laughter, people enjoying their meals, their conversations lively, their plates full. No one inside had any idea how it felt to stand on the other side of that glass, to feel hunger as something more than a temporary inconvenience. He swallowed hard. Would they recognize him if he stepped inside? If he approached a table and said his name, would the shock be enough to make them offer him a meal? The thought was fleeting. He knew the truth. The name Alexander Drake carried no weight here. Not in these rags, not in this world where money and status dictated human value. The growl in his stomach deepened. He turned away. The night stretched before him, cold and endless. Where was he supposed to go? The city was vast, but suddenly, there was no place for him in it. No penthouse, no luxury suite. Just streets. Just cold. He kept walking, past alleys where shadows moved in restless silence, past neon-lit bars spilling music into the night, past people who didn't even notice him anymore. His legs ached. He had never walked this much before. It was strange how he had lived in this city his whole life, yet it had never felt this large. He reached a park, a small one tucked between buildings, the kind of place he had never paid attention to before. The benches sat empty, except for one, where an old man lay curled beneath a tattered blanket. Alexander hesitated. He didn't want to be here. He didn't belong here. But he had nowhere else to go. He sat down at the far end of the bench, his body stiff. The wood was hard, the cold seeping through his coat, biting at his skin. The city still moved around him, but he was no longer part of it. Minutes passed, maybe hours. His eyelids grew heavy. His body shivered, but exhaustion overpowered discomfort. He let his head rest against the back of the bench, his thoughts slipping into darkness. Then, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "You're new." Alexander's eyes snapped open. The old man on the other end of the bench was staring at him, his face worn, his eyes sharp despite the deep wrinkles around them. Alexander didn't answer. The man smirked. "Figured. You still got that look." Alexander frowned. "What look?" "The one that says you still think this is temporary." The old man chuckled, a dry sound that held no real amusement. "It's always temporary at first, until it's not." Alexander shifted uncomfortably. "What's your story?" the old man asked. "Junkie? Bad debts, or just bad luck?" Alexander didn't respond. The old man shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The streets don't care how you got here. They just swallow you whole." A silence stretched between them. The city moved on. Alexander stared up at the sky. No stars, just clouds, thick and unmoving. "Got a name?" the old man asked. For a moment Alexander hesitated. Then, "No." The man gave a knowing nod. "Smart. Names don't mean much here anyway." Alexander looked at him, really looked at him. The man's coat was thinner than his, the holes in the fabric revealing glimpses of skin. His shoes were barely held together, duct tape keeping the soles from falling apart. And yet, he had given Alexander half the bench. He could have told him to leave, he could have ignored him, just like everyone else. Instead, he spoke to him, acknowledged him. It was a strange feeling, to be seen. The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of bread. He held it out. "Eat." Alexander hesitated. The man smirked. "Don't let pride kill you." Alexander took the bread. It was stale, dry. It tasted like dust and regret, but it was the best thing he had eaten all day. "Thank you." The old man just nodded. "Get used to it." Alexander looked down at the half-eaten bread in his hand. For years, people had given him everything: deals, contracts, obedience, fear. But this was the first time someone had given him something that truly mattered. The city stretched on around them, indifferent to the two men sitting on the bench, one who had always been here, and one who was just beginning to understand what it meant to have nothing. Just when he thought no one would care, someone did. The old man sat beside him, his presence steady, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, half-eaten piece of bread, and handed it to Alexander. No words, just an action that spoke volumes. Alexander hesitated. His hands, once accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, now trembled as they closed around something so simple, something so human. The bread was rough, stale, hardened by time and exposure. But in that moment, it was more than food. It was kindness. It was proof that even in the lowest places, generosity could still exist. "Now tell me, when was the last time someone helped you when you least expected it?" Share your experience in the comments. Alexander swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He had spent years surrounded by people who worshipped wealth, who saw kindness as a weakness. And yet, here he was, being fed by a man who had nothing to give. He took a slow bite, the taste of dry bread, mixing with the bitterness of realization. He had walked past people like this before, had ignored them, had dismissed them as mere shadows on the streets of his empire. And now, he was one of them. The old man leaned back against the bench, stretching his legs. His clothes were thin, his body frail, but his eyes, they held a wisdom that Alexander had never seen in the men who sat around his boardroom table. "You're not used to this." Alexander didn't answer. He didn't need to. The old man chuckled. "Didn't think so." Silence settled between them, the kind that didn't demand an explanation, the kind that simply existed. Alexander took another bite, slower this time. The hunger gnawed at him, but he forced himself to eat with control, to not devour it all at once, because he didn't know when he'd eat again. That thought sent a chill through him. For the first time, the idea of survival wasn't a business term. It wasn't about market shares or economic downturns. It was real. It was immediate. It was raw. He glanced at the old man, curiosity creeping in. "What's your name?" The man smirked, shaking his head. "Names don't matter much here." Alexander exhaled slowly. He understood. A name wouldn't feed you. A name wouldn't keep you warm at night. Names belonged to another world, one that had no place here. "How long?" Alexander asked. The old man turned his gaze toward the city skyline in the distance. "Long enough." The answer carried weight. Long enough to know the rules. Long enough to stop expecting people to care. Long enough to forget what life used to feel like before the streets swallowed him whole. Alexander watched him for a moment. This man had nothing. No warmth, no security, no certainty about tomorrow. And yet, he had given him food. "Why?" The old man turned, his expression unreadable. "Why what? Why help me?" The man let out a dry chuckle. "Because I know what it's like to be hungry." The simplicity of the statement struck him. Alexander had never known hunger before tonight. Not like this. Not the kind that twisted your stomach, made you question how much longer you could keep moving. And yet, this man, this stranger, had looked at him, seen his need and given what little he had. He shifted on the bench, staring down at the ground. For years, he had surrounded himself with men who only gave when they could get something in return. This man had given without expecting a single thing back. Alexander swallowed the last bite of bread, the weight of everything pressing heavier on his shoulders. The city continued around them, people passing, cars honking, lights flashing in storefronts. But none of it felt real anymore. Not compared to this moment. Not compared to the quiet generosity of a man who had nothing. The old man stood, stretching. "Get some sleep." Alexander looked up at him. "Where are you going?" The man shrugged. "Nowhere, everywhere, just another night." He turned to walk away, his steps slow but steady. Alexander hesitated. Then, "Wait." The man stopped. For a moment, Alexander considered asking him to stay. But what right did he have to ask anything of him? Instead, he simply said, "Thank you." The old man gave him a small nod. "Don't thank me, just remember." And with that, he disappeared into the night. Alexander sat there, the sounds of the city growing distant. He had spent his entire life believing that money determined a man's worth. That power was everything. But tonight, a man with nothing had just taught him the most valuable lesson of all. And for the first time, Alexander wasn't sure who he really was anymore. Alexander decided to test people, to see who would help and who would turn away. Days had passed since his first night on the streets. Hunger was no longer a passing discomfort. It was a weight that settled deep in his bones. Sleep came in restless fragments, the cold pavement his new reality. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was done watching. Tonight, he was going to see the truth for himself. Would people recognize him? Would they stop? Would they even care? He made his way to the part of town where his name once meant everything. The district of luxury, where suits were crisp, cars gleamed under city lights, and people measured success by the weight of their wallets. His legs ached from walking, but he pushed forward, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was both. The five-star restaurant stood just as he remembered it, grand, elegant, alive with warmth and music spilling onto the streets. Inside, behind those glass doors, were the people who used to fight for his attention, the investors who once begged for his time, the business partners who had shaken his hand, sworn loyalty, then turned their backs when his empire crumbled. Would they recognize him now? Alexander pulled the tattered coat tighter around himself, stepped closer to the entrance, and extended his hands, palms up, empty. The first person passed without hesitation, a man in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Alexander barely had time to speak before the man brushed past him, eyes forward, determined to pretend he didn't exist. Then came another. A woman draped in fur, perfume thick in the air as she turned her head away, pretending to check her phone. Alexander swallowed hard. Another man. Then another. Some glanced at him briefly, their expressions unreadable. Others didn't even bother. And then, a familiar face. Jason Carter. His former CFO. A man who once sat across from him in meetings, who once smiled as they toasted billion-dollar deals. Alexander straightened slightly, waiting. Jason stepped forward, his pace slowing just a fraction. For a split second, there was hesitation in his eyes. Recognition. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Jason walked past without a word. Without a second glance, Alexander felt something inside him shift. He wasn't surprised. Not really, but it still hurt. One by one, they passed. His former colleagues, his so-called friends. The same people who had once begged to be in his presence. Now, they couldn't even spare him a look. The truth was clearer than ever. It wasn't wealth that made people turn away from the homeless. It wasn't discomfort. It was fear. Because deep down, they knew it could be them. And that terrified them. Alexander stood there, the night stretching around him, his breath visible in the cold air. Then, a voice, soft where uncertain. "Sir?" He turned. She wasn't dressed in silk or designer labels. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or stepping out of a black car. She was just a waitress. Her uniform was simple, her hands red from the cold. Her dark curls pinned back in a way that suggested a long shift. And yet, she was the only one who had stopped. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Are you hungry?" Alexander didn't know what to say. For the first time in days, he wasn't invisible. She studied him, her eyes holding something he hadn't seen in a long time: kindness. "I don't have much," she admitted. "But wait here." He watched as she disappeared into the restaurant. Minutes passed. He expected her to forget, to get distracted, to never return. But then, she did. A steaming cup of coffee in her hands. "It's not much, but it's warm." She handed it to him, offering a small, uncertain smile. Alexander wrapped his fingers around the cup, the warmth spreading through his frozen skin. It had been so long since he had felt something this simple, this human. That was the moment that changed everything. He had set out to test people, to see if anyone would notice. And out of all the people in that restaurant, out of all the wealthy, powerful, successful men and women, only one person had stopped. Not because of status, not because of recognition, but because she cared. Let's be honest. If you saw someone struggling, would you help? Even if no one was watching? Tell me below. Weeks passed. Alexander learned more on the streets than he ever did in boardrooms. He learned the weight of an empty stomach, the sharpness of cold pavement beneath his body, the way people avoided eye contact, as if looking at him too long might make them vulnerable to his fate. He learned who people truly were when they believed no one was watching. He had once been a man who controlled the world with the stroke of a pen. But here, in the shadows of the city, the rules were different. Here, wealth was measured in kindness, in survival. And then, the time came. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden light spilling over the city as Alexander stood outside the very restaurant where he had been ignored. The same place where his former colleagues had walked past without a second thought. But tonight, he was not a beggar. He had returned, not in rags, not in torn shoes, but in the tailored suit that once defined him. The very presence that had once commanded respect now made them look twice. He stepped through the doors. Conversations quieted. Eyes flickered toward him, brows furrowed in confusion. They recognized him. Whispers rippled through the room. It couldn't be. Alexander Drake was gone. A ghost. A fallen empire. And yet, here he was. The maître d' rushed forward, his voice laced with urgency. "Mr. Drake, Alexander lifted a hand. "Don't." The man fell silent. Across the room, a familiar face turned toward him. Jason Carter. His former CFO. The same man who had walked past him without hesitation. The same man who had taken part in his downfall. Jason's expression shifted, his mouth opening and closing like a fish struggling for air. "Alex, Don't." The word was cold. Absolute. Jason paled. And then, the others came. The investors, the partners. The ones who had called him their friend, until he had become worthless to them. They stood now, caught between disbelief and desperation. The weight of their actions settled into their faces. They had left him for dead. They had turned their backs. And now, they wanted redemption. "I didn't know it was you," one of them stammered. "If I had known," Alexander's stare cut through him. "You would have what?" Silence. Because they knew the answer. They wouldn't have walked past him. They wouldn't have ignored him. But they didn't help because they thought he was nobody. And that was the point. Alexander exhaled slowly, the tension in the air so thick it felt suffocating. And then, he turned away from them. They weren't worth his time. His attention shifted to the back of the room, to the waitress, the only one who had stopped. She stood frozen, eyes wide, coffee pot still clutched in her hands. She had no words, and she didn't need them. Alexander stepped forward. "You're not supposed to be here." She blinked. I work here." "Not anymore." Her face paled, her breath catching. She thought she was being fired. Then Alexander smiled, a real smile. "You own it now." The room went silent. The waitress stared at him, unblinking. "What?" "You heard me." Alexander gestured around them. "This restaurant, it's yours." The coffee pot slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. Murmurs spread. The same people who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a server now looked at her in a new light. But it didn't matter, because she had earned this. She had shown kindness when no one else had. And kindness was worth more than any fortune. Alexander turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he stopped. Because there was one more thing left to do. The old man sat on the same park bench, his tattered coat wrapped around him, his hands tucked inside for warmth. He didn't look up as Alexander approached, not until a shadow fell over him. Slowly, the old man lifted his gaze, and his tired eyes widened. Alexander smiled. "I owe you a home." The old man blinked, his weathered face unreadable. "I don't need charity." "Good," Alexander said, "because this isn't charity. It's repayment." The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "You learned something, didn't you?" Alexander nodded. "Yeah, I did, and what's that?" Alexander exhaled, his gaze sweeping over the city that had both raised him and broken him. "That wealth doesn't make a man rich." The old man smirked. "Took you long enough." Alexander laughed, a real, deep laugh, the kind he hadn't felt in years. Then he held out a key. "Let's go home." And for the first time in a long, long time, he truly understood what it meant to have everything.
This was never about money. It was never about power. It was about humanity. Alexander Drake had spent his life believing that wealth determined worth, that power commanded respect, that success was measured in numbers, in properties, in the weight of his name. But in the end, it was a simple act of kindness that changed everything. Not from the people he had once called friends. Not from the men and women who had shaken his hand in marble-lined boardrooms. But from those society ignored. A homeless man who had nothing to give, except a piece of bread. A waitress who could barely afford her own meals, but still offered a stranger a cup of coffee. They had given without hesitation, without expectation. And in return, life had given back to them. But those who had turned away, the ones who had passed him without a second glance, they had lost something far greater than money. They had lost their own humanity. Because the truth is, kindness costs nothing. Yet, it is the most valuable thing in the world. We live in a time where people chase wealth, status, and recognition, where they measure success in things that can be taken away in an instant. But when all of that is gone, what remains? What defines you when you have nothing? Is it the car you drive? The clothes you wear? The people who surround you when you have something to offer? Or is it the way you treat those who can give you nothing in return? So the next time you walk past someone in need, what will you do? Will you look away? Pretend not to see? Tell yourself it's not your problem? Or will you stop? Will you show kindness, not because you have to, but because you can? Because, in the end, that is what truly matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, then do one thing. Share this message, like this video. Subscribe to Rare Tales Unfold. It's completely free, and together we can remind the world that kindness is never wasted. Because one act of kindness can change everything.